Hey, welcome into the Sunday side session on a Saturday. Nebraska, of course, played on Black Friday, and Nebraska played like Nebraska does on Black Friday, better than their opponent, and yet still leaving without the win. That is how it goes for Nebraska. 13-10 loss, walk-off field goal. If this sounds familiar, it's because you saw it last year or any number of previous years. And so we will dive into it. And this week's guest on the Sunday side session, making his Sunday side session debut, I'm pretty sure. Ravi Lulla, you know him with Damon Benning over on 590 Hurrdat. However you get it, there's a variety of ways that you can get their show. And so we're excited to have Ravi on. Ravi, how's it going?
Not too bad. Was really, it's kind of funny when I committed to this, and I've been, I've lived in Nebraska my whole life, so I should know better. But every time I commit to doing something like this, I always assume it's going to be after a win,
Yeah.
and it always feels like a much better idea in that moment than it does waking up the next day and be like, oh man, that was rough.
You know, when I started doing these, I assumed they would be more wins than losses I would be talking after, but that certainly hasn't been the case. Nebraska is bowl eligible and will go to a bowl game, and that's progress, but it is hard, I think, for Nebraska fans to feel anything but uh, levels of mild annoyance to outright embarrassment on losing that game on Friday. I mean, I. Uh, I don't even know how to sum up in words the appropriate way to describe how Nebraska just blew that game because you've seen it enough times and it was everything everyone said could haunt this team and it all just plays out basically late third quarter the entire fourth quarter. And
Yeah, I mean,
that's the
the
game.
only the only difference would have been if it had actually gone to overtime. That would have checked the
Mm,
final nightmare box, right? But
yeah.
the yeah, I don't know what I'm the word for me I think is bewildered. I'm
Yeah.
just it's not that I'm stunned that they're capable of losing a football game that way. I'm just kind of stunned to watch how it actually played out, right? Because it wasn't just okay, bad special teams or untimely turnover stuff like that. Like the turnover on special teams was like almost a little heartbreaking because you've got this guy in Vincent Shavers who's trying to do the right thing,
Yep.
and it's like I thought it hit both guys before him live in real time. To
Yeah.
be totally honest, I and the guy, my buddy, I was watching the game with it's like, I don't think it hit the first guy. And I was like, okay, but it definitely hit the second guy. And then Shavers jumped in. It's like, nope, didn't hit like we see the replay, didn't hit the second guy either. And I'm still not convinced the Iowa guy didn't touch it first.
Right. That's the other
Right.
part of it. To me, it's almost borderline simultaneously touched. And so then, of course, the call on the field is what's ultimately going to be what stands. Do you remember who the second player was? Because I had the
It
same
was Prude.
opinion as
It
your
was Braylon
friend.
Prude.
Yeah. And so I didn't think Garcia Castaneda touched it, but I was pretty sure the second guy touched it. And then it's like, all right, Shavers is trying to do the right thing. And then you see the replay. And I don't put I mean, if there's blame in that situation, it's just largely on Isaiah Garcia Castaneda. There's a part of me that's like, Nebraska plays with fire, trying to catch every punt inside the 10-yard line, anyways. So you could have easily been out of there. If you get stopped and you have to start the drive at the 5, so what? Because you're going to punt them to the 50 and your defense is going to play. Like, there's a part of me that's just baffled that Nebraska, who wasn't a threat to return a punt at any point yesterday, puts themselves in that situation where you even have your punt returner attempting to catch that ball because it landed at what, the 9, the 8? I mean, it was
Yeah, I
inside the
mean,
10, wasn't it?
it was. I remember being very close to the 10, so I
Yeah.
don't remember if it was right at the 10, the 8. What I do agree that I don't understand their insistence on catching the ball inside the 10. That to me is pretty baffling. And you're right. Like if you're not going to return, I get not losing lost yardage and letting catching the ball at the 30 and not letting it run to the 10 or something. Right. That
Mm-hmm.
makes sense to me. And I do understand there is value at starting at the 8 instead of the 2, just in terms of positioning. But is it worth, especially in that much traffic, is it worth the risk of kind of what happened there? Probably not. but it is kind of, again, it's just the whole thing is just kind of baffling, right? Like IGC looks like he touches it, doesn't touch it. Braylon Prude looks like he touches it because he thinks IGC touched it, doesn't touch it. Vincent Shaver sees both these guys look like they touched it. He sees Braylon Prude act like the first guy touched it, so he tries to do the right thing and jump on the ball. And that's why, like, Vincent Shaver's awareness, honestly, cost them the possession in that spot. And you can't put that on Vincent Shavers because he's trying to do the right thing. It's hard to put it on Braylon Prude because he's trying to do the right thing. Obviously, if you're going to put it on anybody, probably has to go on IGC. But I don't know, like that whole thing. It's like, okay, they didn't even really screw up that much, and it still ended up disastrously, right? Like the decision to catch it or not catch it at the 8-yard line shouldn't end up like that.
I mean, I think you can sum this game up. You can sum these two teams up. You can sum the last decade up by comparing that play and Iowa botching the kick return and somehow miraculously just getting the ball at the 30 anyways, or the 25. Like they screw up that kick return. The guy clearly touches it and bats it into the end zone, and they get a touchback out of it. Like that's how it has worked for Iowa. But when Nebraska has a mistake, it just has to be the worst result imaginable. And that's just sort of how it's felt around here forever. And so, but if that was the only special teams issue last night, Nebraska still wins that game. Like that's
the frustrating part, right?
Right. It kills me that you knew coming into the year the special teams was going to be an issue. You assume that at some point they're going to show some level of progress. And I'm not even talking about just the place kicking, because I think a lot of times, I'm guilty of this too. We talk about special teams and really all we're talking about is the punter and the kicker. But this year, it was so much more than that. Their coverage units were bad. Their return units were bad. They can't snap a football. And it all just comes home to roost. And of course, it comes home against a team like Iowa that literally is the best special teams team that's on your schedule every season.
Yeah, I think the part that was frustrating for me about the way it played out last night is over the last few weeks, the special teams had actually gotten better to the point where I wasn't thinking about them all the time. Like I know at one point in the season, and not to say that they were great, but at one point in the season early, right, every time Nebraska went out to punt, you're like, oh God, I just hope they get this thing off. That had largely gone away. The snapping issues had largely gone away. Obviously, John Hole emerged and you felt decently good about the place kicker. There still had some issues with coverage units. Totally understand that. Still had some issues with decision making on catching punts and things like that. But they had largely shored up a lot of the issues on special teams to the point where it didn't feel like this absolute impending disaster every time the unit walked onto the field. And then obviously it rears its ugly head on Friday night. But, kind of like you said, though, it's even if it was just the special team stuff, all of it,
Right.
even if it's all the special team stuff, they still win the game. Right. But then you've got the missed tackling on the Caleb Johnson touchdown.
The one bad play.
It accounted for half their yardage.
Yep.
It accounted for almost half their. It's literally 45% of their yardage.
Yeah.
It's a 74-yard touchdown. They had 164 yards on the night. It's literally they had one bad play on defense, but it wasn't even like a blown coverage or anything like that. They had him behind the first down marker. He shouldn't even gotten a first down on that thing. And you've got a few guys miss tackles. You've got one guy running into another guy trying to make the tackle that frees Caleb Johnson. It's just this whole disastrous sequence that leads to their only productive play of the night, really. And then on top of that, you've got the turnover at the end of the game with Raiola fumbling. Like it had to be all of them is the crazy part of it. Nebraska in general played so well, I think, that it took all of those terrible things happening, which again, I'm not absolving anyone of responsibility there. Like the terrible things happen for a reason, but the defense played so well that it took all those things to happen. The offense had so many opportunities. I mean, the offense was moving the ball pretty consistently. I know they only end up with 330 yards of total offense, but they were moving the ball pretty consistently. And then you think of, okay, well, What if Jalen Lloyd doesn't get overthrown on that opening possession? What if Isaiah Nair doesn't? I still don't know what happened on that ball to Isaiah Nair. His hands
Just
didn't even
missed it.
his hands didn't even touch the ball though. It wasn't
Yeah,
even a drop. I don't even
he
know if he
missed
saw
it.
it.
Yeah.
Like he looked like an outfielder who lost the ball in the sun.
Yeah.
Like it's not like he just hit the
He
ball
looked
off his glove.
shell-shocked after that happened too.
I
Like,
mean,
utterly shell-shocked.
I was shell shocked that it
Well,
happened.
I think everyone was, but when you see it in a player, it's
I still
extra
don't
concerning. Yeah.
I still don't know what happened. I don't
Yeah.
know how you miss it. There was no one in front of him. It wasn't tipped. I don't know how you miss a catch by the margin he did when there's no other factors that we're aware of. But you've got that. You've got there's a like a 25-yard corner route to Fedoni that he's wide open on that Raiola misses. Like there's all of these things because if Nair makes that catch, I'm not sure if it's a touchdown, but you're certainly looking at a
Yeah,
very
you've got a
easy.
great chance to score.
You've got a great chance to score there. The Lloyd one, I'm pretty sure would have been a touchdown, and then
Oh, yeah.
you're 7 on the first one instead of 3. Like they're just the points are all over the place, and it required all of them to not go Nebraska's way. But leave the special teams, leave whatever else. They just had guys that didn't make plays, and I think you're going. I'm very excited to see some hopefully different guys in those positions in the bowl game.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be curious how they approach the bowl game. I'm going to be curious what the practice looks like. Obviously, it doesn't count towards anyone's, 4-game limit, so you could flood it with freshmen. Riley Van Poppel will be there. It's great to see him again. It is one of those things where I don't think you win an extra game this year if he plays throughout the rest of the season, but I have little doubt that they would have been better in some games if you had Riley Van Poppel. It was curious. They made that decision to redshirt him, but they did it after they had already used him for like 3 games. And so I don't know if there was like a nagging injury or something that there was a concern there, but it would have been wonderful to have him for Big Ten play. And then, I had wanted to see younger guys on defense for a while. And then obviously I thought, that was probably the best game Isaac Gifford played all year. I
Yeah,
mean,
it probably
honestly,
was.
he
And
had a
unfortunately,
fantastic spill tackle down there in the that goal line sequence.
mm-hmm.
Somebody blew it up. I think someone told me it was Ty Robinson blew it up. And then, he's spilling out. And I think he has John Bullock behind him. So I don't know that Caleb Johnson's scoring necessarily. But in that situation, the round for a loss, just a huge, huge play that you had to have. And, Gifford has had his struggles this year, but I thought he came up big last night.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the best games that Gifford played. I'm typically not worried about him in the run defense if he's not really worried about the pass. Typically, I think my issues with Singleton and Gifford are when they
Play
get
action.
it's the play action, right? It's when they get
their eyes are in the wrong place and their feet can't move.
100%. Yeah, it's the eye discipline, it's the hesitancy, it's the uncertainty, it's the delayed decision making. When they're flying around and playing downhill, like they're both really good players, but they get confused too much. They overthink things too much, and they end up looking slow and out of place. I unfortunately did think it was probably one of the worst games that Bullock played all year. He missed a lot of run fits, I thought it looked like. And I know Caleb Johnson didn't do a ton in terms of running the ball. It was like 17 for 45, I think. Like you'll take that every day. But it looked like there on some of those ones that he did break loose a little bit. And it looked like Bullock was over pursuing and didn't fill the run gap on the cutback lanes. And then also he's one of the guys that was on the missed tackle.
He was the primary guy. I mean, he had him stood up, and you're just thinking like someone's just going to come through and push him out of bounds. He's right. One of the shocking things on that play is he's right on the edge of just being out of bounds. Someone just needed to push him,
Yeah.
And it just didn't happen. But yeah, he was central in that. There was a couple play sequence that he had that was pretty phenomenal, and I think it was basically back-to-back TFLs. But yeah, I mean, he normally pretty great, but Nebraska's defense as a whole, you really couldn't have asked for anything more than what they gave you. And that's what's, I think, so incredibly frustrating to be talking about a loss. It'd be one thing, Ravi, if we were sitting here and Nebraska wins 13-10, and you're thinking they could have put this game away. They didn't have to have the drama. but they still have that win, right? Just being on the other side of the margin and it being the exact same way that they seem to lose to Iowa every year has just like, I don't know, it broke my brain a little bit last night. It really did.
Yeah,
It
I guess
truly did.
the difference for me is in years past, I don't think Nebraska, at least in my perception of it, and I don't really have, I didn't go back and look at the old box scores or games or anything, but the thing for me is it never felt like Nebraska had been this dominant before.
Mm-hmm.
Like Nebraska dominated that game.
Yeah.
Like I don't.
I think you're right on that. They were more 50-50 or even sometimes 55-45 Iowa, and Nebraska had a chance to steal it.
Nebraska's in it. Their coin flip games, their toss-up games, whatever. This didn't feel like a coin flip or a toss-up game. This felt like Iowa was getting their head caved in the entire night and just hung around and it felt is a weird analogy. It felt like the rope-a-dope fight with Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, like where George Foreman is just wailing on this dude round after round after round, and then Muhammad Ali at the end is just like pop, 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 and it's over. Like that's what it felt like to me.
I mean, I hadn't considered that analogy, but I don't know that is an inaccurate statement of how to describe that. I mean, if you were scoring rounds, Nebraska won the first 3 and decisively lost the 4th one.
Yeah,
so,
not to say
what
that
it was.
Not to say that Iowa was doing it intentionally the way like Ali was, obviously, but that's just how it felt. I bet if you were watching that fight real time, you're like, oh man, Foreman's killing him. Like, and that's what it felt like Nebraska. It just felt like Nebraska was bludgeoning Iowa, and eventually they were going to die, and then they didn't. And then they're like, nope, I'm still here, and you lose. Like it was that to me is the part that broke my brain is just I haven't seen very many games. I mean, a couple people brought up second half against Michigan State, I think 2021, where they don't have a first down, they don't, I think 0 rushing yards, like they don't do anything in the second half, and Nebraska still manages to lose that game. It felt like that, except for the entire game, and that's the part that I'm having a really hard time wrapping my brain around because you don't see football games play out that way almost ever.
Yeah. I hearken back immediately to Matt Rhule's first game with Nebraska, that Minnesota game where they dominated pretty much the entire second half, only for the one drive led by Kaliak Manis. And then you have the Anthony Grant fumble. But that's what that game felt like to me. And, Brian Christopherson was on. We did a post-game pod last night, and he basically was like, I don't know anyone who didn't think he was going to make that kick or that Iowa's kicker wouldn't make that kick. And I thought the same thing. And then he's like, Minnesota, you expected them to make that field goal. Like when Nebraska is on, the knife's edge and a college kicker is kicking, and even though it's a college kicker, you almost always expect they're going to put it through against Nebraska. And they largely have. I mean, that's the remarkable thing. In these game-winning situations, Nebraska hasn't seen a guy miss. Maryland didn't miss. Iowa hasn't missed any of their 4 opportunities that I can think of off the top of my head. Minnesota didn't miss. Who else have they walked off by? Wisconsin hasn't missed. Like it's truly incredible. Yeah. That might be a fun off-season podcast. We did the overtime last summer, and maybe this time we'll just go through every walk-off kick, the degree of difficulty of it, and then how teams are somehow like 12 for 12 against Nebraska and walk-off field goals going back for like a decade. So that'll get people excited. That'll really, bring the listens and the exciting comments. Let's switch over because there was some stuff in this game that I did like quite a bit. And I think one of the talking points, besides just how dominant the defense played, Nebraska wins that game. We're probably talking about the 2-headed rushing attack of Emmett Johnson and Dante Dowdell.
Yeah.
And how, really in just a matter of a few weeks, Dana Holgorsen, I don't know, like I always hesitate because I don't want to just give him this, like all of this credit, but it is hard for me not to notice how much better the running game has looked in 3 weeks than it did in the previous X amount of games going all the way back to 2023. I mean, and it was little stuff like all of a sudden, I don't know if you're going to remember this specific play. Nebraska's near midfield, and I think the run is designed to go off tackle for Dante Dowdell, And yet he sees the crease open up before the off tackle, and he gets skinny, slips inside the hole, and picks up 8 yards. Like, we didn't see him do that all year. And then now he's doing it against maybe the best defense that they played going back to Ohio State. And really one of the best defenses that they played all year. I mean, statistically. So I was really encouraged by what Emmett Johnson and Dante Dowdell have done in a 3-week sample size with Dana Holgorsen and the run principles that he's kind of introduced. And along with that, I mean, the pass protection wasn't great late. Nebraska's offensive line just looks like 5 new people in the last 3 games. Like, it was like nobody knew who they were. They just revealed themselves to be a competent offensive line. And now all of a sudden you have this running game that I want to see more of that now. I mean, if you would have told me that my takeaway at the end of the year is that I wanted to see more from Emmett Johnson and Dante Dowdell in 2025, I would have laughed in your face.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point, and it did kind of get lost in just how the results played out. But it is pretty staggering how good the running game has looked, and I'm not sure most people would have had that kind of on their bingo card for what to expect from Dana Holgorsen. The improvement from Raiola, sure. The the getting the ball out quicker, even the wide receiver improvements largely. Like, Banks has looked like a different person.
Yep.
In the last 3 games with Dana Holgorsen.
He looked explosive on Friday in a way that he kind of hadn't, starting with that big vertical catch. And then he had a great catch on a slant route where he's giving an Iowa defender a piggyback ride. He had the one that got tipped that I think would have went for 15, 20 yards if he would have been able to bring it in.
Yeah.
And it just kind of got redirected. And I think he lost that one in the lights because he was pretty upset with himself for not catching it. But yeah, I thought we saw a different version of Jamal Banks, certainly the last couple of weeks.
Well, he's looked explosive. He's been way better in perimeter blocking. Like, he's just been way better in every aspect of the game. He's winning one-on-one battles, So I even, maybe not to this degree, but I expected some of that, right? Holgorsen's got a history with wide receivers, and that makes sense to me. The running backs, I thought it would look like a more functional running game, just because, if you're calling a game a little bit more coherently and cohesively, like, you think just everything tends to look a little bit smoother. But the fact that it's been as good as it has been, and really how it's looked, just the eye test of it, it looks like a functional running game. It looks like you've got a couple pretty decent backs. I still think I would still make the argument that I made at the beginning of the season, that none of their running backs are special. They're all just fine.
100%, and I still feel that now. I do want to agree with that.
For much of the year, they haven't looked fine, right? They haven't even looked like fine running backs.
Even below average.
Yeah, when I say fine, I don't mean bad. I just mean, like, yeah, you should be able to get a decent running game out of those guys, but you're not going to have a Caleb Johnson or an Ashton Jonty, or
you don't have a difference maker, but you still have an effective running game.
Yeah, 100%. You don't even have like a Roy Halou level guy, but you got some just decent guys back there, right? And they finally looked that, and maybe even slightly better than that over the last 3 games. And that I did not anticipate that coming, but it is something that, like you said, I really look forward to. Hopefully, if Holgorsen returns next year, that to have a full offseason of that, to have a full spring of that, to have a full fall camp of that, because DB and I have talked a bunch on the show. A lot of the hesitancy, I think, you see with Dowdell. I think a lot of the guys not hitting the hole or hitting the cutbacks the way you want them to, or anything like that, is just reps, right? They're just not getting the number of reps, or hadn't got the number of reps they needed to within certain play designs to feel comfortable enough to understand, hey, this is probably where that defender is going to be coming from, or hey, this is where that cutback lane is going to be. So to have that many more reps with those guys, and I think if you have a clear cut, hey, it's Emmett Johnson and Dante Dowdell, those guys are going to get the most reps. I think that helps a ton. And that's one of many things that, if Holgorsen does remain on staff, that I'm pretty excited for.
What do we make of Dylan Raiola's freshman season? Just a regular season. You had 12 games. Nebraska goes 6-6. I don't have his full stats pulled up right in front of me. A fair amount of turnovers. probably a little less splash plays than I might have guessed before the year.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, I'm super encouraged because no other freshman in the country did what he did. Like I do not think that he has been given credit nationally or even sometimes locally within the fan base too. What he is doing, no one else in the country did in 2024. No other Power Four freshman quarterback started 12 games. No other Power Four freshman quarterback had that much put on their plate. No one was asked to do what he had to do. And it wasn't always pretty, but man, you don't even have to like squint. You can see where this could look really good. It's got a lot of work. There's a lot of work that has to be done. But at the same time, I guess, how do you sort of come down on this senior season, freshman season? Good Lord.
I think it's about what should have been expected. I know early we got our hopes up that it was, something else. But this is
nine touchdowns, 2 interceptions for the first 4 games, maybe.
Yeah, and so you're looking at it and you go, okay, this guy's maybe special, and he still might be, right? But this is generally what it looks like. I did some deep dives on freshman quarterback that have started in years past, and went back about a decade, and this is usually what it looks like to varying degrees. And even in that scenario, almost none of them start from day one. Like you have a couple, you're talking like Caleb Williams. I think the only one I can remember off the top of my head that started from day one, like Trevor Lawrence didn't even start day one because he took over.
He had a battle with Kelly Bryant.
Kelly Bryant, who ends up at Missouri. Like, so he ended up starting like 10 games, but there's not very many guys that just are the dude from day one, and so it's hard to compare numbers. But so Dylan ends up with 67% completion, right at 2,600 yards, 12 touchdowns, 10 picks, right? You do have to take that with a little grain of salt. 2 of those, that very easily could be 14 touchdowns and 8 picks with the couple that literally were switched after the call on the field. And how much differently do you feel if it's 14 and 8 versus 12 and 10? Probably a little bit.
Right. Well, and in one of those situations, you probably get a win against Illinois too.
100%.
I mean, if that is a touchdown and not an interception, or at the very least, if that's just an incompletion and neither a touchdown or an interception.
Yeah. So like you've got some just a little bit of wiggle room in those touchdown interception numbers. But I'm largely encouraged. I agree with you. I thought we would see more deep ball shots, more of those big splash plays. It seemed like he didn't have a great feel for those in a way he seemed to in high school. So I'm not sure if that was, comfort level with receivers. I don't know if that was play calling or what it was exactly. But I was a little surprised by. But for the most part, you can see it. It's all there. Even some of the mobility in the pocket, especially when he was fully healthy at the beginning of the season. You can see. I would like to see him just kind of rip it more. On some of those throws, even the long, kind of slow developing route to Barney. The Barney almost drops as he's heading to the sideline, but ends up bringing it in. Like, just put that on him. Like, that doesn't need to be. I know he had pressure on his face, but there's some of those which is like, hey, just put it on him, and that's something I think he's certainly capable of it. He's got the arm for it. I would like to see a little bit more of that, but he was a true freshman guy that was, he was given audible power day one race, basically, right? Like, that's the other thing we don't talk about is even the guys that are given the reins this early, which again, there's not that many, is they aren't given the whole thing, right? It was, hey, you're not only the starter, but you get the entire pie, you get the entire playbook, you can audible into and out of whatever you want. And I think even though mentally he's capable of that, that was probably too much to put on him as a guy experiencing college football for the first time. So I'm largely encouraged, honestly, by his season. I know that we got out over our skis a little bit early with what it could look like this year, but we know that's in there. We know he can be successful at this level. We know he can make the right decisions. We know he can get the ball out quick. Would I like to see sometimes where he's a little bit more decisive, gets the ball a little bit quicker, maybe takes some more shots one-on-one? Sure. But he's a true freshman who was an upgrade at the quarterback spot, clearly. I mean, there's no like Jeff Sims has started for 3 years. That was not a green guy. And he was better than Jeff Sims was last year. He obviously was better than Harvard was last year. Like, he was just a better quarterback than anybody Nebraska had in that room. And going forward, I only expect that to continue. And I think the trajectory for it can be really good.
You said something that has kind of just struck me over the last second half of the season. It felt like when things kind of turned for him, his way of fighting against the tide was he tried to be too precise with his throws. And so instead of just, as you said, you let it rip and put it on guys, it's like he's trying to place the ball. And I know that you play baseball, and I've used this analogy before, but it's like when you're pitching and you're just trying to you're trying to be too precise and you're trying to place a baseball instead of just throwing it. Like, sometimes you have to let the mechanics take over and just throw it and not be as focused on, all right, I'm trying to drop this thing perfectly right here. I'm trying to put the exact amount of right touch. Because then I think you're in your head and you're not able to just rip it when a guy's wide open and you have the ability to do it. And so I think a lot of that comes with time. I mean, the best thing that happened this season, he played all 12 games. We expect him to play the bowl game. I'm sure there's going to be some off-season cleanup surgery somewhere, some way. The other thing we haven't talked about, guy basically played injured since Illinois.
Yeah.
He's dealt with an ankle. He's dealt with, I think, a shoulder. None of this is publicly discussed because I have more respect for Dylan now, given the hit that he took in that UCLA game. And then he looks, I think he almost needed that to happen because he's running with a little bit more aggression now and less hesitant. Like, do you remember how awkward he was in the first part of the season? They had that play where it was his own read and he kept it, and by the goal line, he kind of tripped under his own feet just trying to score from 2 yards out where it's an easy touchdown. He's more, I wouldn't say decisive in that regard because he can certainly get better there, but I think he's more comfortable knowing how to take the hits, and it happened, right? Like, he got absolutely smacked in that UCLA game, got up, and he's fine. Like, I do think that that's an important thing, especially at a position where, you get sacked, you get hit, but it's a lot different when you're trying to scramble for yardage and a big guy just, picks you off that way. So I do think that that's ultimately going to help him as well, in his progression. Let's finish up with this, and it's not, I don't know that it's an easy conversation, but I suspect I'm getting the jump on one that you and Damon will have, many other radio shows or podcasts will have. Do we consider this season a success for Nebraska? Just talking regular season, they got to the bowl game. Obviously, people are going to expect to win there or want to win there because 6-7 looks a hell of a lot worse than 7-6. Another reason why that loss on Friday night is just brutal, because you could have at least gotten to 7-5 and then gave yourself, nobody knows that the Outback Bowl is now the ReliaQuest Bowl, but gave yourself a name brand bowl game. And I still expect they're going to end up, at worst Music City Bowl. But do you consider 6-6, what they went through, everything they have on their roster, everything they're going to lose, would you consider this a success for Nebraska?
Yeah, so
loaded question. I'm fully aware that this is an unfair thing to do to anyone at 8. I guess it's 9:07 in the morning now.
I think yes. Now, did it live up to my expectations? No. I think this team pretty easily could have been an 8-win team.
I still think they should have been a 9-win team. I really do.
Yeah, I mean, nine was my prediction before the year.
9 was mine as well, yeah.
I didn't expect Indiana to be what Indiana was. I was counting that as one of the wins. So, obviously that matters. Illinois was better than I thought they were going to be, so that matters too. So there was a couple teams that cropped up there that were better than I thought. So, I look at it, I go, okay, 9 was maybe a little aggressive. I think 8 was still very much in reach. Yep. But I think something cannot have reached my expectations and still have been successful, right? I look at this team and honestly, I look at the way I felt after they got bowl eligible last week, and I was like, oh yeah, this is a big deal. for Nebraska, for where they've been at, like getting over that hump is a really big deal. And I think at this point, I feel like the burden that was on the older guys to make a bowl game was a lot larger than maybe some of us realized heading into the year. And I do think that affected them. Now, you could make the argument like, hey, if they're going to be impacted by these things, like just get them out of there, right? But I think there was, I think I said this on the show last week too, but I think there was this sense from Coach Rhule that he wanted the older guys to take on that burden and get to the bowl game so that the younger guys could be unburdened by that particular goal, right? And that they could then strive for something else. And I do think that matters. And so just getting over that hump, a hump that Nebraska should have cleared, not had in the first place, right? They should have cleared many times over. I mean, how many 5 and 7s, how many trips into Iowa City are you sitting there and going, all right, just this one more, or, so I think just getting that out of the way makes it successful in and of itself. Was it as successful as it could have been? Obviously not, right? But I'm going to have a hard time sitting here and saying, oh, the season was a failure when they accomplished something that no Nebraska team in 8 years had accomplished. Did they leave some things on the table? For sure. But I still think it's progress. I still think it's a step in the right direction, a smaller step than I was hoping for. But I can't sit here and say, hey, it was a failure when they accomplished something nobody has since 2016. I just can't do it.
That's good perspective. That really is. I have a tough time with it because, like you, I expected this team to be better than certainly what the final record indicates. I find it frustrating in the sense that and this just seems to be a hallmark with Nebraska football going back for a while, they have more talent than these teams that they're losing to. It's one thing you lose to USC, and I predicted that they would lose to USC, both before the year and then before that game. And you're able to play with them, but they're just, I can't think of the name of the receiver.
Branch.
But he's 6'5", and Malcolm Hartzog is what it is, and sometimes talent's just going to win out. That's just what it is. When you're losing to Iowa and to Illinois and to, I don't know who else.
Even Indiana. I don't think Indiana is more talented than Nebraska.
No, and I agree. So then it becomes a question. The concern I have is the way Nebraska was set up this year. It wasn't to me just, okay, you get 6 and 6 and you get the monkey off your back, which is, again, an accomplishment. The setup this year was basically you have an opportunity to go have a special season, and they weren't able to cash in on that. I think they take a step back in a lot of areas, particularly on defense, because I don't think they have the depth. And maybe some young guys just show up and surprise me. But look at the season that you wasted from Ty Robinson to go 6 and 6. Look at the season that you wait. Like John Bullock was phenomenal this year. And you're going to lose those guys. Now, that doesn't mean Vincent Shavers can't do that. And I'm excited about Vincent Shavers. I obviously wax poetic about Riley Van Poppel. Full disclosure, I think I have the most shares in the Nebraska media on Riley Van Poppel, so I'm going to wax poetically every time I get. But the way they're going to be constructed, I'm not sure that they're going to have like this abundance of talent. They're not going to be as old as they have been. And so then it becomes, all right, do I trust the coaching? Do I trust the staff? And I got to tell you, Ravi, through 24 games of Matt Rhule as Nebraska's head coach, I'm not walking out of here feeling particularly great about what Nebraska has in game on Saturdays. Every close and late situation where they need a drive, they are so conservative and so lack of urgency to get down the field. It pains me. There's something about it, like, and it's unfair because it's an imperfect situation, right? Like last year, he's trying to win with Chuba Purdy and Heinrich Harburg and Jeff Sims. And this year you have Dylan Raiola, but you have some other issues that are problematic, or your special teams gets in the way. But at some point, you can't lose all of these close games and not have it be a reflection of what's happening with the in-game coaching. Now, I don't think Kirk Ferentz out-coached Matt Rhule yesterday. I really don't. But do I think that Kirk Ferentz and that Iowa team throughout the duration of the season are built to win games like that and Nebraska isn't? Absolutely. Iowa thrives in those situations. Yeah. They get the 54-yard punt from their punter. They get the 53-yard field goal from their kicker. They get the snap from their long snapper. Their defense makes the splash play to get not only a stop, but they get the ball. They find ways to win games, and repeatedly under Matt Rhule, Nebraska has found ways to give games away in the fourth quarter. And now I think that the roster is going to be a little bit worse in the sense that you don't have as many reps. You might have some real talent coming in.
Yeah.
But it's hard. Like, I have a real tough time. I think they made progress and they took a step forward, and these bowl games matter. I don't know at the end of year 2 how I feel about Matt Rhule, and I find that concerning for the future of the program and at least how you think.
So let me break down some of the things you said there a little bit, because I think they're all valid points, but I think sometimes we find value in looking things on a kind of a micro level and sometimes macro level. And I think this is one where we need to get into specifics a little bit more, right? Because I actually think the team is more talented next year. They're not as experienced, but the guys that I think are going to play next year, I think are better than the guys that played this year. Like, I believe that 100%, especially on defense. Mm-hmm. I think Nebraska is super talented young. And there's going to be some growing pains because those guys haven't gotten the reps that they are going to need at some point. But I actually think they're more talented over the next 2 years than they were over the first 2 years. So take that for whatever you will. Mm-hmm. Part of the reason I believe that, though, is let's look at some of these guys we're talking about. Do they have a Ty Robinson next year? No, not necessarily. But they didn't have a Ty Robinson when they took over either. That's right. That rule.
He became that guy. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, I have to count that on the ledger, right? Like, I know they didn't recruit him, but we saw Ty Robinson before Matt Rhule and Terrence Knighton and Tony White, and we saw him after, and he's a different human being. Nash is the same way. You love Riley Van Poppel, like that has to go on the record of Matt Rhule, Terrence Knighton as well. You've got the most shares of Riley Van Poppel. I got the most shares of Keona Davis. I'm obsessed with that dude. Like, I think he's going to be incredible, and that's a guy I think is going to be really good. I'm huge on Shavers. I'm huge on McGahee. I'm huge on Prince Will. I still think you're going to get a really good Cam Lenhard, even though this year was a little weird there, right? I think you've got a ton of talent at a bunch of those spots, and I haven't even gotten to the defensive backfield yet, which I think is just better, younger than the guys that we saw play this year. I use Nash and Ty especially as examples because, like, those are guys that developed under Matt Rhule. And then I want to go to the offensive line, right? We didn't like any of those guys, right? Like, when Coach Rhule took over, we didn't like a single one of those guys. And we saw, especially the last 3 games, but really over the last 2 years, that went from a unit that we thought was going to be horrible to one that we were like, it's fine to better than that, right? And with mostly the same guys. And frankly, the second straight year, they've been on a third string left tackle, right? Yeah. And when we hardly even notice. Bryce Benhart went from a guy we couldn't get out of town fast enough to a guy that we were thrilled came back this year. I know he gave up the terrible strip sack at the end there, but Bryce Benhart was, again, he was kind of like a Ty Robinson, where this dude was left for dead, basically, and then came in and became a really good player for Nebraska because of the coaching he received over the last 2 years, right? So are there areas of concern? Sure. Like, I don't know what to do with Garrett McGuire and the wide receivers, because it seemed like they went from pretty bad under him to Dana Holgerson has got this thing. He's obviously been working with wide receivers. They're way better now, right? I don't know what to do with EJ Bartho, right? I think there's some decent guys in that room. Obviously, Emmett Johnson has been good. Dante Deldells looks like he's getting better. But, the fact that EJ didn't play until the last 3 games, really, that's a red flag to me. Is that a Marcus Satterfield thing? Is that an EJ thing? I don't know, right? So there's places that I have questions. But I don't have questions about the overall development. You brought up 2 separate things. Overall development and talent, I feel okay there. Game day Saturdays, that's a separate issue, and I can understand the concern there. I really can. The one thing I'll bring up, because we always can compare and contrast this with Iowa because they're right there, and these games always play out this way, is Kirk Ferentz has been doing this for 20 years.
Right.
They didn't do this in year 2 either, right? Like they just didn't. My grandma and her family were super big Iowa fans. They're close, so I've obviously watched a lot of Iowa football for my whole life, even before Nebraska's in the Big Ten. This wasn't Kirk Ferentz early either. Like this has been a process and a culture that's been established for 2 decades. And yes, Coach Rhule and staff have lost a ton of close games. So did the previous 3 staffs, right? Like that's not unique. And so Nebraska is almost in the exact opposite position of Iowa right now, where they've spent most of the last 20 years losing these games. And Matt Rhule is trying to incrementally get them to the place where they start winning those games. And Iowa's been winning these games for 2 decades now. And so I totally understand your concern and being like, yeah, I don't really know where we're at with Matt Rhule in year 2. That's fair. I also think we're in I think it's much closer to going the right way than the wrong way, just from all of those things that I brought up. I can understand how you can interpret it the other way. I really can. But I do think some of that context matters. And I do think, year 1 to year 2 in Matt Rhule was always the big jump, but he also did this rebuild differently than he did the first 2.
Sure.
Right? I think year 2 to year 3 actually might be the big jump for Nebraska because of what I said with the development that I think is happening and we've seen to a certain extent happening with the young guys, and the fact that I just think the young guys are better.
No, you bring up valid points. I don't think Nebraska is going to be a black hole of suck next year. I'm just somewhat curious, in part, how some of these developments play out because certain guys that we were excited about for 2024 just didn't have an impact on the season. I mean, and we don't know what or the rhyme or reason why, but Cam Lenhart wasn't as impactful. Prince Will wasn't as. Now, are those because of playing situations? Is it because MJ Sherman was really
Sherman
good?
was better, yeah.
And
Maybe
it doesn't
maybe
mean
Shavers and McGahee passed him a little bit too. Like those guys were good. Like there's a lot of possibilities there. But yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. No, and so it's a lot of it is, do I have that blind faith that the development will be there? And we certainly have examples of it because as you went through, and Gunnar Gatula is actually a great example of it. I mean, I know he had the false start. I know it's been a little rough at times, but he stepped in and played left tackle half of the, splitting that time with Mazuka. Nebraska is better for it because you don't know what you're going to get from Teddy Prohaska. I mean, I think that's just a giant question mark.
Well, and that's a guy nobody liked.
So did you at least have someone?
Gatula's a guy nobody liked. Like coming out of high school, you talk to all the high school guys, you talk to the recruiting guys, they're like, he's kind of just a guy that's out there. And for the most part, we didn't even notice him, which I think is a positive.
Yeah. I mean, I thought he did it particularly well. I would counter that your old cohort before Damon, why am I blanking? Andrew, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. He had Gunnar Gatula as his number 1 player in the 2023 class. And it was shocking when that came in. I'm not going to lie. One other person had him on their Super 6, and Andrew had him at number 1. So I do want to clarify at least one person in your orbit, in your world, had him on their Super 6. But yeah, a lot of it for me is just what do I trust, and do I think that there's going to be, I think this is a big couple weeks of potential staff changes. There's certainly going to be different coaches. I think that's obvious. Yeah. I mean, there's, regardless of who it is, there's just going to be a different staff for Nebraska next year. Who those who those coaches are will be fascinating. How the portal plays out for Nebraska is going to be fascinating, both in terms of who are they able to retain and who can they also bring in. Brings up some big questions. And then there's still some high school guys that, signing day somehow is 4 days from now.
Yeah.
My brain, you want to talk about broken brain. I haven't even considered that I'll be writing about Nebraska signing their 2025 class here in 4 days. So there's a lot that's going to happen over the next month. But I think a lot of it for me is just on game day. I thought Matt Rhule was going to be a better in-game coach than Scott Frost. And I think he's a better coach than Scott Frost in about a billion ways. But man, on Saturday, do I not feel great when it's close and late, when Nebraska's plotting their ass down the field, when they have no urgency whatsoever. We saw that against Wisconsin last year. We saw it against USC for that final drive. We saw it against Iowa. And that's not necessarily Matt Rhule, but I think he's conservative by nature. He wants to play through that defense by nature. And it's just had bit them every time. And at some point, that either has to change or that's just sort of who they are. But you made a lot of valid points. And again, I don't think Nebraska is just doomed by any means. And as we talked about earlier, I think Dylan Raiola is a big beacon of hope to have that at your quarterback spot. Not a lot of teams have that. It's how they can build around them, and it's kind of the player procurement that's really, I think, going to kind of decide a few things. And then, of course, we're going to have the long off season of having this conversation every day up until when they play in August once the bowl game ends. So we have that to look forward to.
Yeah, I think the big thing for me is they probably have more questions than answers heading into next year in terms of whether it's coaching staff or player personnel or whatever. Although some of those, I think, like you said, will be answered over the next couple of weeks. A lot of those will be answered over the next couple of weeks. But I always come back to this idea: what good are the answers if they're the wrong answers, right? And I think that's where Nebraska's at. I think some of the older guys that Matt Rhule wanted to do right by were just the wrong answers. And yes, you had them, and they were knowns, and they were established, but they were the wrong answers to the test. And so I think there was a maybe subconscious sacrifice on Matt Rhule's part, or maybe it was a longer term play to say, hey, I'm going to reward the guys that I think handle their business the right way Monday through Friday, Sunday through Friday, however you want to put it. And I think we can get to the bowl game with those guys. And I think I can show that if you do the things that I want you to do, then you'll be rewarded for it, whether it's with progress on the field, making a bowl game, whether it's with playing time and the things that I'm asking of you directly resulting in, NFL stock or whatever it is, and so there's a part of me that is in wait and see mode on that to see if that pays off, right? And I think they probably could have had a couple more wins this year if they had played things a little differently. But whether it was subconscious or conscious or not, I do think there was a choice that was made to say, hey, I think there's some other things here that I need to establish that are more important than win 7 and 8. Not more important than win 6, to be clear, but that were more important than win 7 and 8. That I think long term, speaking as Matt Rhule here, that I think long term will pay off. That I think is the strategy, and that I think is the thing we don't know the answers to yet. And that's why I'm not as concerned about having more questions than answered heading into the offseason.
Great stuff, Ravi. Wouldn't have expected anything less. Appreciate you joining here on a Saturday morning for the Sunday side session Iowa edition. Wish everybody to stop by Husker 24/7. Got a great deal going on right now. If you're not a VIP member, great time. As I mentioned, signing day coming up, transfer portal opening up. Lots of stuff going to be going on at Husker 24/7. Plenty of great coverage. There's a basketball team that's winning games. Ryan Christopherson will cover them closely. We have the podcast that goes up usually on Tuesdays or Wednesdays for that as well. So lots of coverage going on with Nebraska athletics. We will have all of it. Ravi, thank you again for joining.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Everybody else, we'll catch you next time.